Some bonds are not formed by fate, but by accident so precise it feels like destiny refusing to be ignored. The storm had already swallowed the edge of Blackridge Forest when the sound of dragging footsteps broke through the wind. Lily Carter should have turned back. Every instinct she had told her that nothing good survived a night like this outside the main road. But she did not turn back. Instead, she followed something she could not name yet, something heavy and broken lying just beyond the broken fence line of her small cottage. When she found it, she froze. A massive black wolf lay half submerged in wet grass, its fur darkened by rain, its breathing uneven but still present. It was not moving aggressively. It was not growling. It was simply there, like something too powerful to die but too exhausted to stand. Lily's first thought was not fear. It was concern. "You are going to freeze out here," she whispered, as if it could understand her. Against every rule of common sense, she pulled the wolf inside her cottage. The wooden floor creaked under its weight as she struggled to drag it near the fireplace. The cottage was small, warm only when the fire was alive, and tonight it struggled against the storm pressing on the walls. Lily knelt beside the wolf, her hands trembling slightly as she checked for wounds. "Okay, you are alive," she said softly, more to herself than to it. The wolf did not resist. It did not flinch when she brought warm water and a cloth. Instead, it remained still, watching her with eyes that felt far too aware for something unconscious. She hesitated only once before beginning to clean the mud from its fur. "This is going to feel strange," she murmured, almost apologetic, as she gently worked through the thick black coat. The wolf's breathing slowed. Not weaker. Not fading. Slowing as if something inside it had decided there was no need to remain tense anymore. Far beyond the forest, in a place of stone halls and controlled silence, Ethan Blackwood stopped walking mid-step. His counsel had been speaking, but the sound of their voices faded as something inside him shifted without warning. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was recognition without source. His jaw tightened slightly. "Your Majesty," one of the elders asked cautiously. Ethan did not answer. Because he could feel it. Not see it. Not hear it. Feel it. A pressure in his instincts, a distortion in the usual calm of his internal system. His wolf was no longer simply present within him. It was reacting. But not to threat. Not to command. To something gentle. Something unfamiliar. Something precise enough to override instinctive vigilance. Ethan turned slightly, one hand lifting as if to signal silence without needing words. The council immediately stopped speaking. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the pause in him. The absence of immediate calculation. Back in the cottage, Lily gently wiped the last traces of mud from the wolf's shoulder. "There," she said quietly. "That is better." The wolf's eyes remained on her. Calm. Unblinking. Present in a way that did not match what it was supposed to be. Ethan's breath slowed in the distant hall. For the first time in years, his internal system did not escalate toward control or analysis. It settled. Not because he commanded it, but because something unknown had already done so. And without understanding why, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood took one step back from his council chamber doors, as if the world itself had just pulled his instincts in a completely different direction. The cottage remained warm only where the firelight reached, the rest of the room fading into soft shadow beyond Lily Carter's careful movements. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the windows, but inside, the only rhythm that mattered was the slow, steady presence of the black wolf lying on the wooden floor. Lily had wrapped a rough blanket around its lower body, not understanding why she felt compelled to be gentle with something so large and unfamiliar. She should have been afraid. Instead, she was focused. "You are not making this easy," she murmured softly as she adjusted the cloth near its shoulder. The wolf did not move away. It simply watched her, calm in a way that did not match its size or nature. At that same moment, far beyond the forest, Ethan Blackwood stood in silence within the stone corridor of his council wing. The meeting behind him had fully dissolved into background noise, irrelevant compared to the internal shift he could no longer ignore. His wolf remained calm. Not subdued. Not controlled. Stable. That stability had never occurred without structure, command, or environmental control. Yet none of those factors were present now. Ethan's gaze lowered slightly as he attempted to trace the origin of the sensation. It did not originate within him. That was the problem. Or rather, that was the revelation. A council member cautiously stepped forward. "Your Majesty, should we continue the discussion regarding the northern border reports?" Ethan did not answer immediately. The question reached him, but did not anchor. His attention remained divided between the physical room he occupied and the internal system that no longer obeyed its expected patterns. Slowly, he raised one hand again, signaling silence without looking back. The council obeyed instantly. Lily exhaled gently as she rinsed the cloth again in warm water near the fire. "I wish I knew what happened to you," she said to the wolf, her voice quiet but steady. "You look like you have been through something terrible." The wolf's ears shifted slightly, not in distress, but in awareness. Ethan felt it instantly. The response was not emotional in the human sense. It was structural. His wolf did not react to distance or command. It reacted to her voice. That realization tightened something subtle within him, not in pain, but in recognition of a system behaving outside its expected design. He took a slow step forward in the corridor, then stopped. There was no reason for movement. No tactical requirement. No directive. And yet the internal pull remained consistent, as if something beyond him had already determined direction. Back in the cottage, Lily carefully pressed the damp cloth along the wolf's fur, working slowly to remove the last traces of dirt. "There," she said softly. "That is better." The wolf's breathing remained steady, unusually calm for something of its size and presence. Ethan's expression shifted slightly for the first time since leaving the council chamber. Not confusion. Not alarm. Something more precise. Assessment without precedent. His wolf had never stabilized under passive conditions. It required control, dominance, or internal equilibrium maintained through structured authority. Yet here it was, calm without instruction. Stable without reinforcement. And the only variable that had ever coincided with that state was not within his domain. It was outside it. Lily leaned back slightly, observing the wolf with quiet curiosity rather than fear. "You are not normal," she whispered gently, almost smiling despite her exhaustion. Ethan exhaled slowly in the corridor. The phrase should have meant nothing. It should have been irrelevant. But instead, it aligned with everything he had begun to observe across distance he could not measure. His wolf remained calm. Not because he commanded it. Not because the environment allowed it. But because something, somewhere, was holding it in a state it had never achieved alone. And for the first time in his life, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood did not immediately seek to override the unknown. He simply followed it inward. The cottage remained unchanged in its physical simplicity, yet the atmosphere within it felt increasingly unfamiliar to Ethan Blackwood the longer he tried to interpret it through logic alone. Somewhere beyond the reach of court structure, political responsibility, and the defined hierarchy of his world, a system he had always considered absolute was beginning to respond to something entirely unclassified. His wolf remained calm. That fact no longer felt incidental. It felt intentional, though not by his intent. In the corridor of the council wing, Ethan stood motionless, his posture controlled out of habit rather than necessity. The voices of his advisors had faded into irrelevant background input, none of them aware that the Alpha King was no longer processing their words in any meaningful way. His attention was elsewhere, locked onto a sensation that defied distance, direction, and explanation. Lily Carter, inside her cottage, shifted slightly as she adjusted the blanket over the massive black wolf. "You are warmer now," she said softly, as if speaking to something. Fragile rather than powerful. The wolf did not respond verbally, yet its breathing remained steady, synchronized in a rhythm that felt almost unnatural in its consistency. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly in the corridor. Not in anger, but in focus so precise it bordered on unfamiliar vulnerability. His internal system had always responded to hierarchy, command, threat, authority, and control. Yet what he was experiencing now did not fit any of those categories. There was no command being issued. No threat being neutralized. No hierarchy being enforced. And still, his wolf remained in a state of absolute calm. One of the council members hesitated before speaking again. "Your Majesty, the border request requires your approval." Ethan did not turn. "Not now," he said quietly. The response was simple, but it carried a weight that immediately ended further questioning. Inside the cottage, Lily stood and stretched slightly, glancing toward the window where rain continued to blur the outside world into indistinct movement. "I do not even know what to call you," she said with a small breath of uncertainty, looking down at the wolf. "You are not just a stray, are you?" The wolf blinked slowly. That single motion traveled through Ethan's awareness like a shift in structural alignment. It was subtle, but undeniable. His wolf was reacting not to command, not to threat, but to her presence in real time, as if every small action she took was part of a stabilizing framework he had never consciously identified. Ethan finally moved again, walking slowly toward the end of the corridor where an open archway led to the outer balcony. The wind struck him immediately, cold and unfiltered, but it did not disrupt the internal clarity forming within him. If anything, it sharpened it. His wolf was calm. Not subdued. Not restrained. Calm in a way that should not have been sustainable under isolation. And yet it was. Which meant the variable sustaining it was not within his environment. It was elsewhere. The realization did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as structure. Something external was maintaining internal equilibrium without permission, command, or awareness from him. Back in the cottage, Lily carefully moved a chair closer to the fireplace and sat down beside the wolf, her movements slow and careful, as if she had already accepted its presence as part of the space rather than an intrusion. "I think you are staying longer than I expected," she said quietly, almost amused despite the exhaustion in her voice. The wolf did not move away. It did not resist. It remained. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the stone railing of the balcony. Not in anger. Not in control. In recognition. Because for the first time since he had become Alpha King, he could not determine where his authority ended and where something else began. And worse than that, he no longer knew whether that distinction had ever truly existed at all. The rain outside the cottage had not lessened, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter, almost suspended, as if the world beyond the wooden walls had lost its authority over what mattered within. Lily Carter sat near the fireplace, watching the giant black wolf with a kind of cautious calm that had slowly replaced her initial uncertainty. The wolf remained in the same position, no longer appearing like something broken or dangerous, but something enduring, as though it had chosen stillness rather than collapsed into it. Ethan Blackwood stood on the balcony of his estate far away, the wind pressing against his coat as he stared into the dark horizon without truly seeing it. His internal system remained in a state that no longer aligned with anything he had been trained to interpret. His wolf was calm. That fact persisted without variation, without explanation, and without permission from his authority. It was not obedience. It was not suppression. It was stability without origin. In the cottage, Lily leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees as she studied the wolf with quiet curiosity. "You are not like anything I have seen before," she said softly, as if the words themselves were not meant to disturb the fragile balance of the room. The wolf's ear flicked once, subtle and controlled, responding not with instinctual agitation but with awareness. Ethan closed his eyes briefly on the balcony. The sensation returned more clearly now, no longer distant or abstract. It was consistent. Structured. As if his internal state had been recalibrated by something external that did not operate within the rules of hierarchy or command. His wolf was not reacting to fear, challenge, or dominance. It was reacting to presence. Ethan exhaled slowly, opening his eyes again. This should not be possible, he murmured to himself, though there was no one present who needed to hear it. Yet the statement did not resolve anything. It only deepened the contradiction forming within his understanding. Back in the cottage, Lily carefully stood and walked toward a small shelf, retrieving a folded cloth and placing it near the wolf as if offering comfort rather than instruction. "I am not sure what I am supposed to do with you," she admitted gently. "But you are not leaving into that storm tonight." The wolf did not move. It remained, as if her words were not commands but conditions it had already accepted. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the stone railing of the balcony. Not in aggression, but in a rare form of internal tension that had no outlet in control or decision-making. Because he could feel it more clearly now. The stability of his wolf was not originating within him. It was being maintained. Sustained. Anchored. And the anchor was not within his reach. He turned slightly, looking back toward the interior of his estate where his counsel still waited for decisions that no longer felt connected to the reality unfolding within him. Their world operated on hierarchy, authority, and structure. But what he was experiencing now did not belong to any of those systems. It belonged to something far simpler, and far more absolute. Lily returned to her seat by the fire, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of water as she glanced again at the wolf. "I guess I will just call you quiet for now," she said softly, a faint trace of warmth in her tone. The wolf did not react with tension or withdrawal. Instead, it remained still, as if the word itself had meaning beyond language. Ethan opened his eyes fully, the wind pressing harder against him as though the world itself was trying to pull him back into defined structure. But structure no longer held the same certainty. Because across distance, storm, and silence, his wolf remained calm only in one condition he could not control. And somewhere in that realization, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood understood something that did not yet have a name. Not dependence. Not command. Not hierarchy. Something older than authority, and far more stable than control. The night deepened over both the forest cottage and the distant estate, yet in neither place did time feel entirely consistent anymore. In Lily Carter's small home, the fire had begun to settle into a steady glow, casting soft light across the wooden floor where the massive black wolf remained lying in complete stillness. The storm outside had not fully passed, but its presence now felt distant, as if the cottage existed within a protected boundary that the weather could not fully penetrate. Lily sat quietly nearby, her movements slower now, more careful, as though she had begun to accept that whatever was inside her home was no longer just a temporary problem but a presence that required understanding rather than reaction. "You are really strange," she whispered gently, not as an accusation but as an observation formed through exhaustion and curiosity. The wolf did not move away. It only watched her, its breathing steady, its posture unchanged from the moment she had first brought it inside. There was no aggression, no panic, no instinctual instability. Only calm. A calm that did not belong to circumstance. Far beyond the forest and the reach of the storm, Ethan Blackwood stood in silence on the balcony of his estate, the cold wind pressing against him as if trying to force him back into the familiar structure of command and control. Yet his internal state no longer responded in familiar ways. His wolf remained calm. That fact repeated itself within him not as reassurance, but as contradiction. He had spent years understanding his internal system as something that required discipline, hierarchy, and dominance to maintain equilibrium. And yet now, without issuing any command, without exerting any control, that equilibrium remained intact. He slowly opened his eyes, looking into the distance without truly focusing on anything within the physical world. "This is not control," he said quietly to himself, though there was no one present to challenge or confirm the statement. The realization did not feel like clarity. It felt like displacement. As if the foundation of what he believed authority to be had shifted slightly beneath him, leaving structure intact but meaning unstable. Back in the cottage, Lily reached for a small bowl of water and set it near the wolf without forcing interaction. "If you are going to stay here," she said softly, "you might as well be comfortable." The wolf did not respond verbally, but its eyes followed her movement with steady attention, as though every action she took carried weight that extended beyond the physical environment. Ethan's fingers tightened briefly on the stone railing of the balcony. Not in frustration. Not in anger. In recognition of pattern repetition he could no longer ignore. Every moment of stability within his internal system aligned with one condition. Distance did not weaken it. Isolation did not break it. Authority did not replace it. It remained constant regardless of his attempt to restructure understanding around it. Lily stood and walked toward a small cupboard, retrieving a folded blanket and gently adjusting it around the wolf's side. Her movements were unhurried, almost instinctive, as if she had begun to treat the presence not as something to manage but something to accommodate. "You do not feel dangerous," she admitted quietly, almost surprised by her own conclusion. The wolf blinked slowly, its body still completely relaxed. Ethan closed his eyes again, this time not to escape the wind, but to focus inward. The result was immediate and unchanged. Calm. Still calm. Not diminishing. Not fluctuating. Not responding to distance or absence. That meant the source was not within him. It was external. Persistent. Independent of his authority. He exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more weight than intended. "Then what are you?" he murmured under his breath, not expecting an answer. But the answer, in its own form, was already unfolding across. Distance he could not measure. In a small cottage illuminated by firelight, a woman who believed she was nothing more than a caretaker was unknowingly sustaining the most powerful internal stability the Alpha King had ever experienced. And in that contradiction, Ethan Blackwood began to understand something that would have been impossible to accept in any previous definition of his world. His wolf was not responding to control. It was responding to her. The night over the estate had grown quieter, but not calmer, as if the world itself had shifted into a lower frequency of existence that only Ethan Blackwood could perceive. He stood on the balcony without moving, his coat unmoving in the wind that should have demanded attention but no longer did. Inside him, the wolf remained calm. That single fact had ceased to feel like an observation and had become a structural reality he could no longer ignore. Across the distance of forest and storm, Lily Carter continued tending to the massive black wolf in her small cottage, unaware that every gentle action she performed was being reflected inside the most powerful internal system in the region. She adjusted the blanket again, carefully tucking it near the wolf's side. "I do not think you are going to leave any time soon," she whispered softly, almost amused by her own assumption. The wolf did not resist. It remained exactly where it was, as if her words carried weight beyond sound. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he stood on the balcony. The connection was not emotional in the way he had previously defined emotion. It was not psychological in a traditional sense either. It was consistent, measurable only through its effect. His internal instability never manifested when she was present. That realization no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like system dependency. A council messenger appeared behind him at a cautious distance. "Your Majesty, the Eastern Patrol awaits your directive." Ethan did not turn immediately. The words reached him, but they did not anchor his attention the way they once would have. After a brief silence, he responded without looking back. "Maintain current formation. No escalation." The messenger hesitated for only a fraction of a second before withdrawing. Ethan finally exhaled, slow and controlled. Even his authority responses were beginning to feel secondary to the internal phenomenon he could not classify. In the cottage, Lily stood and stretched slightly, rolling her shoulders as she glanced once more at the wolf. "You are definitely not normal," she said quietly, her tone softened by exhaustion rather than fear. The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging her presence without needing interpretation. Ethan's internal system responded instantly to that subtle change. Not as reaction, but as confirmation. The stability persisted. It did not fluctuate. It did not degrade. It remained absolute regardless of time passing or distance increasing. That meant it was not self-contained. He finally moved from the balcony, stepping back into the corridor where stone walls and torchlight returned him to the physical structure of his estate. Yet even as he walked, the sensation followed without interruption. His wolf remained calm. That sentence repeated itself within him with increasing clarity, no longer as anomaly but as pattern. A pattern without precedent. Lily returned to the fireplace, sitting down again beside the wolf. The fire cracked softly, sending warm light across both of them. She tilted her head slightly, studying the creature with quiet curiosity. "If you belong to someone," she said gently, "they are probably looking for you." The wolf did not respond. It only remained still, breathing evenly. Far away, Ethan stopped walking again in the middle of the corridor. The thought should have triggered a search protocol, territorial awareness, or protective instinct. Instead, what surfaced within him was something entirely different. A recognition that the wolf was not simply stable. It was calmer than it had ever been under his own command. And that calm only occurred in one consistent condition he had now observed too many times to dismiss. His hand lowered slightly at his side, tension fading without instruction. Not surrender. Not loss. Reclassification. Because for the first time in his life, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood was no longer trying to control the unknown presence influencing his wolf. He was trying to understand why the unknown presence felt more stable than anything he had ever controlled himself. The estate corridors were silent except for the faint echo of Ethan Blackwood's footsteps, each one measured yet increasingly detached from the sense of urgency that once defined his authority. The further he moved from the balcony, the more the internal anomaly persisted without change. His wolf remained calm. That fact had stopped being an observation and had become an undeniable structure within his awareness. Across the forest line, in the small cottage, Lily Carter gently adjusted the position of the black wolf's head on a folded cloth, ensuring it was resting comfortably near the warmth of the fire. She had begun to move with quiet familiarity around it, as though instinctively accepting its presence as part of the space rather than an intrusion. "You really are staying longer than I expected," she said softly, almost to herself. The wolf did not react with tension or resistance. It simply watched her, steady and attentive, as if her voice had become a fixed point of reference in its environment. Ethan paused briefly in the middle of the corridor, his hand resting lightly against the stone wall. Not for support, but for grounding. The sensation inside him remained unchanged. Stable. Consistent. Unnatural in its persistence. There was no fluctuation, no degradation, no return to baseline instability that he would normally expect in isolation from structured command influence. That alone invalidated every prior assumption he had held about internal regulation. A council officer approached cautiously from a distance. "Your Majesty, shall we prepare for evening briefing?" Ethan did not turn immediately. His gaze remained forward, unfocused on physical surroundings but deeply engaged in internal analysis. After a short pause, he responded calmly. "Postpone it." The officer hesitated, then withdrew without question. Lily leaned back slightly on her heels, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face as she studied the wolf again. "If you belong to someone important," she said gently, "they must be very worried." The wolf blinked once. Slow. Controlled. Almost deliberate. Ethan's internal system responded instantly, not as emotional reaction but as confirmation of pattern stability. The wolf's calm state remained unchanged. It was not influenced by distance. It was not disrupted by absence of external authority. It remained constant only within one observed condition that he could no longer ignore. Ethan resumed walking slowly down the corridor, his steps quieter now, as though even his physical movement was beginning to adjust to the internal shift occurring within him. His thoughts no longer revolved around command structure or governance priorities. They were focused entirely on a single unresolved variable, the origin of sustained equilibrium. In the cottage, Lily stood and gently placed another small log into the fire. The flames brightened slightly, casting warmer light across the wolf's dark fur. "I am going to assume you're not dangerous," she said softly, though there was a trace of caution beneath her calm tone. The wolf remained still, unthreatening, its breathing steady and even. Far away, Ethan stopped again at the end of the corridor, where the stone architecture opened toward a quieter section of the estate. He exhaled slowly, his expression controlled but no longer purely authoritative. The realization had begun to settle deeper now, beyond analysis and into recognition. His wolf was not simply calm. It was stabilized. And the only consistent stabilizing factor across every observed instance was not within him, not within his control, and not within his environment. It was elsewhere. Something external. Something persistent. Something he had not yet identified but could no longer dismiss. Lily returned to her seat beside the wolf, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of water as she looked at it quietly. "I think you are not just a stray," she whispered, almost thoughtfully. The wolf did not respond. It simply remained present. Ethan Blackwood finally lowered his hand from the wall and stood fully upright, his posture regaining its natural structure, though his internal certainty had already begun to shift. Not collapse. Not confusion. But reorientation. Because for the first time in his life, the Alpha King understood that his wolf's calm was not something he was producing. It was something being given to him, without permission, without explanation, and without regard for his authority. The corridor lights inside the estate had dimmed slightly as evening settled over the structure, but the atmosphere surrounding Ethan Blackwood remained unchanged in its internal intensity. He stood still for a moment at the end of the hall, no longer moving with the same decisiveness that defined his presence earlier in the day. Not because he lacked control, but because control itself had begun to feel like an outdated classification. His wolf remained calm. That single condition had now persisted across distance, time, and silence without deviation. And that persistence was no longer an anomaly he could dismiss. Across the forest and beyond the storm's fading reach, Lily Carter quietly tended to the massive black wolf in her cottage. The firelight flickered across its dark fur as she carefully adjusted the blanket again, ensuring warmth remained consistent. "You are surprisingly patient," she said softly, almost with a faint smile, as if speaking to something that understood far more than it revealed. The wolf's eyes remained open, steady, and focused entirely on her movements, without aggression or hesitation. Ethan slowly exhaled in the corridor, his gaze lowering slightly as internal analysis continued without interruption. Every logical framework he had previously used to define his internal system was beginning to collapse under one consistent observation: his wolf did not stabilize through isolation, dominance, or self-regulation. It stabilized through something external and singular. That realization was no longer theoretical. It was experiential. A council attendant approached cautiously from behind the stone column. "Your Majesty, the northern reports have been delayed due to weather conditions. Shall we proceed with contingency adjustments?" Ethan did not turn immediately. There was a pause long enough for the question to lose urgency in his perception. Then he responded evenly. "Maintain delay until further notice." The attendant bowed and retreated without further inquiry. Lily leaned back slightly beside the wolf, resting her hands in her lap as she watched the fire settle into steady embers. "I am starting to think you are not waiting for anyone," she said gently. "You are just here." The wolf remained still, its breathing unchanged, as if acknowledging her words without needing reaction. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in frustration but in precision of thought. Because that description matched the internal data he could not ignore. His wolf was not exhibiting reactive instability. It was not searching. It was not resisting separation. It was simply maintaining equilibrium in one continuous condition. And that condition did not originate within him. He resumed walking slowly down the corridor, his footsteps quieter than before, as though even his physical presence had begun to adapt to the shift in internal understanding. The estate around him remained structured, orderly, and obedient to command, yet none of it registered with the same weight it once carried. Authority no longer felt like the center of his perception. Lily stood and walked toward the window, glancing out at the storm now weakening beyond the tree-line. "If someone is looking for you," she said softly, "they must be far away." The wolf did not respond verbally, but its gaze followed her movement with unwavering attention. Ethan stopped again, this time at a narrow opening in the corridor where the wind from outside briefly touched his face. It was cold, grounding, real. Yet even that sensation did not disrupt the internal stability he was experiencing. His wolf remained calm. Not occasionally. Not intermittently. Continuously. That continuity was now the most important variable in his entire understanding of himself. Because something that's stable could not exist without cause. And yet the cause was not within his control. Lily returned to the fire and gently placed another small piece of wood into the embers, watching as the flame brightened slightly. I do not know what you are, she whispered to the wolf, but you feel safe here. The wolf blinked once. Slow. Certain. Far away, Ethan Blackwood finally came to a complete stop. For the first time, he did not attempt to correct, suppress, or redefine the sensation within him. He simply acknowledged it in its purest form. His wolf was calm. And somewhere beyond the reach of his authority, that calm had a source. And that source was not him. The estate had grown quieter as night fully settled, but the silence surrounding Ethan Blackwood was no longer something external. It had become internal, reflective, and structured in a way he could not ignore. He stood in the corridor without moving, his posture steady, his expression controlled, yet his awareness fully detached from the administrative reality around him. His wolf remained calm. That fact persisted without variation, and it had now crossed the threshold from observation into certainty. Across the forest line, in the small cottage illuminated by firelight, Lily Carter carefully checked the warmth of the black wolf by placing a folded cloth near its side, ensuring it remained comfortable through the cold air seeping through the wooden walls. You really do not complain at all, she said softly, almost amused by the thought. The wolf remained still, its breathing steady, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that did not carry aggression but something closer to recognition. Ethan closed his eyes briefly in the corridor, not in exhaustion, but in structured analysis that no longer followed the patterns he had been trained to trust. Every internal metric he had once used to define stability, dominance, and control had begun to fail in explaining the current state of his wolf. It was not reacting to hierarchy. It was not responding to threat. It was not stabilizing through isolation. It was stabilizing through something external and singular, something consistent enough to override all other conditions. A council officer approached cautiously from behind a stone pillar. Your Majesty, the southern border teams are requesting confirmation of orders. Ethan did not open his eyes immediately. The question reached him, but it did not register with urgency. After a moment, he spoke calmly without turning. Hold all active directives until further notice. The officer hesitated briefly, then withdrew without further instruction. In the cottage, Lily stood and moved toward the fireplace, gently adjusting the logs so the fire would remain steady through the night. I am starting to think you are not lost, she said softly, glancing back at the wolf. You are just here. The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging the statement without needing interpretation. Ethan's internal response was immediate and precise. That behavior aligned with every data point he had observed. His wolf did not exhibit instability. It did not fluctuate under absence or distance. It maintained a constant state of calm under one condition alone. That condition remained unidentified, but its effects were undeniable. Ethan finally began walking again through the corridor, his steps slower than before, as if physical movement itself was beginning to adjust to a new internal framework. The estate around him remained unchanged, yet his perception of it had shifted. Authority no longer functioned as the central reference point. It had become secondary to the internal phenomenon he could not yet classify. Lily returned to the wolf's side and sat down again, her movements gentle, her presence calm. If someone is looking for you, she said quietly, I hope they are not worried too much. The wolf did not respond with tension or movement. It simply remained still, breathing evenly, as though her voice itself contributed to the environment of stability. Ethan stopped again near the end of the corridor, where a faint draft of night air passed through an open archway. The wind touched his face briefly, grounding him in physical reality, but it did not disrupt what was happening inside him. His wolf remained calm. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. Continuously. That continuity was now the only reliable structure within his entire internal system. And it no longer matched any explanation rooted in authority, command, or instinctive self-regulation. Lily gently placed her hand near the wolf without touching it, hesitating for only a moment before relaxing again. "You are safe here," she said softly, as if confirming something that had already been decided by the space itself. The wolf's gaze remained steady. Far away, Ethan Blackwood finally came to a complete stop in the corridor. He did not attempt to correct the anomaly. He did not attempt to classify it further. Instead, for the first time since becoming Alpha King, he accepted the simplest and most undeniable observation. His wolf was calm. And that calm was not his own. The night had settled deeper over both the estate and the forest, but in neither place did the silence feel empty. It felt occupied by something unseen, something that had already altered the structure of what silence meant. Ethan Blackwood stood in the same corridor where he had stopped earlier, yet his stillness was no longer that of control or command. It was the stillness of observation that no longer required justification. His wolf remained calm. That fact no longer appeared as anomaly. It had become the only consistent truth he could no longer disprove. Across the distance, Lily Carter sat beside the black wolf in her cottage, the fire now reduced to a steady glow rather than a bright flame. She had stopped speaking for a while, not out of fear, but because the presence in her home no longer required conversation to feel acknowledged. The wolf remained in the same position, its breathing steady, its gaze still fixed on her in a way that felt less like surveillance and more like alignment. Lily finally broke the silence gently. "You really do not act like anything I would expect," she said softly, her voice carrying quiet curiosity rather than concern. The wolf did not move, but its ears shifted slightly, as if registering her words as part of the environment rather than a disruption. Ethan slowly exhaled in the corridor, his gaze lowering as internal processes continued without interruption. Every attempt to classify what he was experiencing resulted in the same conclusion: his internal stability was no longer self-generated. It was sustained. Not through command. Not through suppression. Not through external hierarchy. But through a singular, consistent condition that had no known origin within his domain. A council attendant approached cautiously from behind a column, hesitating before speaking. "Your Majesty, the Eastern Patrol awaits confirmation for night rotation." Ethan did not immediately respond. The request reached him, but it did not integrate into his current priority structure. After a brief silence, he spoke evenly. "Maintain current rotation without adjustment." The attendant bowed and withdrew silently. In the cottage, Lily leaned slightly closer to the wolf, studying it with a calm that had replaced earlier uncertainty. "I think you are not waiting for anything," she said quietly. "You are just here like this." The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, without tension or reaction. Ethan's internal system responded instantly to that observation, not as emotion, but as confirmation of pattern consistency. The wolf did not fluctuate. It did not destabilize. It remained in a continuous state of calm that defied all previous models of instinctual behavior he had studied or experienced. Ethan resumed walking slowly down the corridor, his steps measured but no longer driven by urgency or command necessity. The structure of his estate remained unchanged around him, yet its relevance had shifted. Authority no longer felt like the central organizing principle of his existence. Something else had begun to occupy that position without permission or explanation. Lily stood and gently adjusted the blanket again over the wolf's side, ensuring it remained properly covered as the night temperature dropped slightly. "If you are staying here," she said softly, almost with a faint trace of humor, "you might as well be comfortable." The wolf did not resist. It did not reposition. It remained exactly where it was, as if the environment itself had already been accepted. Ethan stopped again near an open archway where the wind from outside passed through briefly, cold and grounding. He did not react to the temperature. Instead, he focused inward, where the only consistent variable across every observed condition continued to persist without deviation. His wolf remained calm. That calm was not weakening. It was not changing. It was not dependent on proximity or absence of threat. It was sustained by something he could not yet identify, but could no longer deny. Lily sat back down beside the wolf, resting her hands loosely in her lap. "You are not mine to understand," she whispered gently, "but you are here anyway." The wolf's gaze remained steady. Far away, Ethan Blackwood finally came to a full stop in the corridor. The realization no longer carried confusion. It carried structure. Whatever maintained his wolf's stability was not within his control. It had never been within his control. And for the first time, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood accepted a truth that did not require command to exist. His calm was not his own. It belonged to something else. The night had deepened into a silence that felt heavier than weather, stretching across both the estate and the forest cottage as if the world itself had begun to pause in anticipation of something it could not yet name. Ethan Blackwood stood in the same corridor where he had stopped before, yet his stillness was no longer passive. It was focused, structured, and internal in a way that no longer depended on external instruction. His wolf remained calm. That fact, repeated across every moment of observation, had now become the only stable constant in a system that had otherwise begun to dissolve its own definitions. Across the distance, Lily Carter gently adjusted the folded blanket over the black wolf again, ensuring it remained warm as the fire slowly settled into a steady glow. She had stopped questioning why she felt responsible for its comfort. The feeling had shifted from curiosity to quiet acceptance. "You are really something," she said softly, almost amused, as she brushed a few damp strands of fur away from its shoulder. The wolf did not respond with movement beyond a slow blink, its presence still, attentive, and unerringly consistent in its calm. Ethan exhaled slowly in the corridor, his gaze lowering as the internal structure of his understanding continued to reorganize itself without permission. The sensation that had begun as anomaly had now reached a point of undeniable pattern. His wolf did not stabilize under command, hierarchy, or isolation. It stabilized under a single, external condition that he could neither replicate nor control. A council attendant approached cautiously from behind a pillar. "Your Majesty, the night surveillance reports are ready for review." Ethan did not turn immediately. The request entered his awareness, but it did not alter his focus. After a brief pause, he responded evenly. "Hold all reports until morning." The attendant bowed and withdrew without hesitation. In the cottage, Lily leaned slightly forward again, resting her hands near her knees as she observed the wolf with growing calm rather than concern. "I think you are just going to stay like this," she said quietly. "No matter what I do." The wolf remained motionless, its breathing steady, its gaze unwavering. Ethan began to walk again, slower this time, moving deeper into the corridor network of his estate, though the purpose of movement itself had begun to lose its former clarity. Each step felt less like transition between duties and more like continuation of internal analysis that had no endpoint. His authority, once defined by control over external systems, now felt secondary to the unresolved internal condition that persisted without fluctuation. Lily stood and moved toward the small table beside the fire, placing a hand lightly on its surface as she glanced back at the wolf. "You do not seem lost," she said softly. "You seem like you already belong here." The wolf's ears shifted slightly, acknowledging the sound without reacting with tension. Ethan stopped again at a junction in the corridor where dim light filtered through high windows. The air was still, but his internal awareness was not. It remained fixed on a single, unchanging truth. His wolf was calm. Not intermittently. Not conditionally. Continuously. That continuity was not compatible with every model he had previously used to define instinct, control, or internal equilibrium. Something outside his authority was sustaining it. And that realization no longer carried confusion. It carried structure. Back in the cottage, Lily returned to the wolf's side and gently adjusted its position again, ensuring comfort without force. "I do not know who you belong to," she said softly, "but I think you are not alone anymore." The wolf did not resist. It did not move away. It remained exactly where it was, as if the space itself had accepted it. Far away, Ethan Blackwood finally came to a complete stop in the corridor network of his estate. The silence around him was absolute, but within him, something equally absolute had formed. His wolf remained calm. And for the first time, he understood that this calm was not something he generated, controlled, or maintained. It was something being given to him. And he no longer knew whether that truth represented loss of control, or the first real stability he had ever experienced. The night had fully settled across both the estate and the forest cottage, yet neither place felt like it belonged to silence alone anymore. It felt occupied by something unseen, something persistent, something that had already altered the meaning of distance itself. Ethan Blackwood stood still in the corridor of his estate, no longer walking, no longer issuing commands, no longer attempting to reconcile the internal contradiction that had been forming within him for hours. His wolf remained calm. That fact had not changed since the first moment he noticed it, and it had not weakened under time, distance, or absence of control. Across the forest, Lily Carter sat quietly beside the black wolf, the fire now reduced to a steady, glowing warmth that painted soft light across the wooden floor. She no longer questioned why she had chosen to care for it. The act itself had become natural, as if responsibility had formed without decision. "You are not leaving, are you?" she said softly, not as a question that demanded answer, but as an observation shaped by acceptance. The wolf remained still, its breathing even, its gaze fixed on her with a calm that no longer felt unfamiliar. Ethan slowly closed his eyes in the corridor, not in exhaustion, but in structured internal evaluation that no longer followed the frameworks he had been trained to trust. Every attempt to classify the phenomenon failed in the same way. His wolf did not stabilize through isolation, hierarchy, or command reinforcement. It stabilized through a condition that existed outside all of those systems. A condition that remained consistent regardless of his presence, his authority, or his intent. A council officer approached cautiously and stopped at a respectful distance. "Your Majesty, shall we proceed with morning preparation protocols?" Ethan did not open his eyes immediately. The question registered, but it did not alter his internal focus. After a moment, he responded evenly without turning. "Delay all protocols until further instruction." The officer bowed and retreated without hesitation. In the cottage, Lily shifted slightly, leaning forward with her elbows resting near her knees as she studied the wolf with quiet attention. "I think you are waiting for something," she said softly. "But I do not think you even know what it is." The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, remaining completely still otherwise. Ethan opened his eyes again in the corridor, his gaze now steady but no longer directed toward the physical structure around him. Instead, it remained inward, fixed on the only constant he could no longer ignore. His wolf remained calm. Not intermittently. Not conditionally. Continuously. That continuity had no precedent within his understanding of internal systems. It was not generated by control. It was not maintained by authority. It was sustained by something external, something singular, something he had not yet identified but could no longer deny. He took a slow step forward, then stopped again, not because of uncertainty in movement, but because movement itself no longer changed the conclusion forming within him. In the cottage, Lily stood briefly and adjusted the blanket covering the wolf, ensuring it remained properly positioned near the fire. "I do not know where you came from," she said gently, "but you feel like you belong here now." The wolf did not react with tension or withdrawal. It remained as it was, calm, present, and unchanged. Ethan finally moved toward the end of the corridor where the estate opened into a quiet balcony overlooking the forest line. The wind was cold, steady, and real, but it did not disrupt the internal stability he had now come to recognize as separate from all external conditions. His wolf remained calm. And in that calm, he no longer saw coincidence or anomaly. He saw structure. He saw dependence. He saw something that existed beyond his authority and yet directly influenced it. Far below that understanding, in a small cottage lit by firelight, a woman who believed she was ordinary continued to unknowingly sustain the most powerful internal stability in the Alpha King's existence. And for the first time, Ethan Blackwood did not seek to reclaim control over it. He simply acknowledged that something outside him had already become essential to the very system he once believed belonged only to himself.